Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different. I know, we usually hang out with inbred monarchs and their Habsburg jaws, but sometimes you need a break from medieval cousins marrying each other. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about a goddess who basically invented the concept of doing whatever she wanted, consequences be damned. We're spending the next few hours with Freyja, the Norse goddess of love, beauty, fertility, war, death, and also cats. Because why pick one lane when you can have all of them? She's got a flying cloak made of falcon feathers, she rides in a chariot pulled by cats, and she gets first pick of half the warriors who die in battle. Odin, the All-Father himself, gets the other half. That's the kind of contract negotiation I can respect. Freyja is honestly one of the most fascinating figures in Norse mythology, partly because she refuses to fit into any neat little box. She's a fertility goddess who's also a war deity. She's associated with love and beauty, but she's also deeply connected to magic, specifically a type called seiðr, which the Vikings thought was kind of sketchy and unmanly. Freyja did not care. She taught it to Odin himself, and he didn't complain because apparently when you're a goddess who can see the future and control fate, people tend to listen. But before we get into all her adventures and the absolute chaos she caused across the 9 realms, we need to talk about where she came from. Because Freyja isn't originally from Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods like Odin and Thor. She's Vanir, which is a whole different family of gods, and the story of how she ended up in Asgard involves the first war in the cosmos. As one does, the Vanir were gods of fertility, prosperity, and nature. They were about growth, abundance, and making sure your crops didn't fail and your livestock didn't die. Very practical concerns when you're a Viking trying to survive Scandinavian winters. The Aesir, on the other hand, were more about war, poetry, kingship, and cosmic order. They were the gods who ruled from Asgard, and generally acted like they owned the place. For a while, these two groups of gods coexisted just fine, doing their own thing in their own realms. But then somebody had to ruin it. The sources aren't entirely clear on who started it, because Norse mythology was written down by Christians centuries after the fact, and they weren't super concerned with getting every detail right. But the general story goes that a mysterious woman named Gullveig showed up in Asgard. Gullveig was obsessed with gold, like really obsessed. Her name literally means gold drink or gold intoxication, which tells you everything you need to know about her priorities. She wandered into Odin's hall talking about gold, possibly doing some kind of magic, and the Aesir gods absolutely hated her. So they did what any reasonable pantheon of deities would do when faced with an annoying guest. They stabbed her with spears and burned her alive, 3 times, because apparently once wasn't enough. Gullveig kept coming back, and each time they killed her, she just regenerated. Eventually they gave up, and she wandered off, possibly to become a Verova, a seeress named Hyder. The whole thing was deeply weird and probably cursed, and the Aesir should have realized this was going to have consequences. It did. The Vanir were not happy about the Aesir murdering one of their people repeatedly. Some scholars think Gullveig was Freyja herself under another name, because Freyja also loves gold and has a bunch of different names depending on where she's traveling. Other scholars think Gullveig was just some other Vanir goddess who got caught up in Asgard politics. Either way, the Vanir declared war. This was the first war in the history of the cosmos, and it did not go well for anyone. The Aesir were great at fighting. They had Odin, the god of war and wisdom, and Thor, who could level mountains with his hammer. But the Vanir had their own magic, and they were much better at seiðr, the kind of magic that could see the future, curse your enemies, and generally make your life miserable without ever picking up a weapon. The war dragged on. Neither side could win. The Aesir would march out and fight these grand battles, and the Vanir would just use magic to wreck their plans. Eventually, both sides got tired of the whole thing and decided to make peace. They exchanged hostages to seal the deal, which is a very old-school way of making sure nobody backstabs anyone else. The Vanir sent their best, Njord, the god of the sea and wind, and his 2 children, Freyja and Freyja. Freyja was a fertility god associated with sunshine, rain, and good harvests. He had a magic sword that could fight on its own and a ship that could fold up small enough to fit in a pouch but expand to carry all the gods. He was a big deal. Freyja was something else. She arrived in Asgard as part of this hostage exchange, and she immediately became one of the most important goddesses there. The Aesir gods took one look at her and realized they'd gotten the better end of this deal. She was beautiful, yes, but she was also powerful in ways they didn't fully understand. She knew seiðr magic, which involved chanting, trance states, and shaping fate itself. Among the Vikings, this kind of magic was considered ergi, a word that meant unmanly, shameful, something a warrior shouldn't touch. But Freyja didn't care about Viking gender norms. She practiced seiðr openly, and she taught it to Odin, who also didn't care about looking unmanly because he was the All-Father and could do whatever he wanted. The fact that the king of the gods learned magic from a Vanir goddess tells you how respected and feared Freyja was. She set up her hall in Asgard, a place called Sessrumnir, which means seat room or many seats. It was located in the field of Fólkvangr, which translates to field of the people or field of warriors. And this is where things get interesting, because Freyja's hall isn't just some pretty palace where she sits around being beautiful. It's where half of all the warriors who die in battle end up. Yes, half, not all of them go to Valhalla with Odin. Freyja gets first pick. She chooses half the slain and they come to live with her in Sessrumnir. The sources don't tell us exactly what happens there, but given that Freyja is a goddess of both love and war, we can assume it's a pretty good afterlife. Probably better than Valhalla, where you spend all day fighting and all night feasting in preparation for the end of the world. This whole arrangement says something important about Freyja. She's not just a love goddess who sits around looking pretty. She's a psychopomp, a deity who guides the dead. She's a warrior goddess who claims half the honored dead. She's got power that rivals Odin's, and she's not afraid to use it. The Aesir gods gave her a title, Vanadi's, Lady of the Vanir. They respected her. They also probably found her a little unsettling, because Freyja has always had this quality of being just slightly outside the normal rules. She's generous and kind when she wants to be, but she's also fiercely independent. She refuses to be controlled, even by Odin, and that's rare among the Norse gods. She's also extremely wealthy. Freyja loves gold more than almost anything, and she owns some of the most precious treasures in all the 9 realms. Her hall is described as beautiful and grand, her jewelry is legendary, and she wears a cloak made of falcon feathers that lets her fly. Just casually. Oh, you need to fly to another realm. Let me put on my bird cloak. But her most famous possession, the one that causes more trouble than anything else in her entire mythology, is a necklace called Brísingamen. And we'll get to that story in a moment, because it's absolutely wild and involves Freyja doing something pretty scandalous even by Norse god standards. Before we talk about the necklace though, let's talk about her family, because Freyja's personal life is complicated. Her father is Njord, the Vanir god of the sea. Her brother is Freyja, the golden god of fertility and kingship. Her mother is never named in any of the surviving sources, which is weird and has led to a lot of speculation. Some scholars think her mother might have been Njord's sister, because there's a line in one of the poems that mentions the Vanir practicing sibling marriage. The Aesir gods apparently found this shocking and improper, which is rich coming from a pantheon where Odin married his brother's daughter, but whatever. The Vanir had different rules. They were fertility gods, their whole thing was about generation and creation, so maybe incest taboos didn't apply the same way. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Freyja herself had a husband, a god named Other. His name means frenzy or inspiration or poetry, and he's incredibly mysterious. Some scholars think Other is just another name for Odin, because the two names are similar and Odin also represents ecstasy and poetic inspiration. Other scholars think Other was his own separate god who maybe got absorbed into Odin's mythology later. Whoever he was, Other disappeared. He left. Just wandered off into the wider world and never came back, and Freyja was heartbroken. The poems describe her weeping tears of red gold as she searched for him, traveling through all the realms, taking on different names in different lands. She's called Mardril, she who makes the sea bright, probably because of all those golden tears. She's called Hern, Jeffin, Sir, each name a different aspect of her grief and her searching. This is one of the most human aspects of Freyja's mythology. She's this incredibly powerful goddess who commands magic and claims half the dead, but she's also someone who loved and lost and kept searching even though she probably knew he wasn't coming back. The Vikings appreciated that kind of tragic determination. Freyja and Other had 2 daughters together, Hnos and Gersemi. Both names mean treasure or precious thing, which is very on brand for a goddess who loves gold and beauty. The daughters don't feature much in the surviving myths, but their names tell us they were deeply loved. So there's Freyja, daughter of Njord, sister of Freyja, mother of 2 daughters, abandoned wife of a missing god, teacher of magic, claimer of the slain, lover of gold and beauty and cats. She's got layers. She contains multitudes. And she's about to get herself into some extremely interesting situations. Let's talk about Brísingamen. The Necklace of the Brísings, the story of how Freyja acquired her famous necklace, is one of the most scandalous tales in Norse mythology, and it tells us a lot about her character. Specifically, it tells us that Freyja will do absolutely anything to get what she wants, and she does not care what anyone thinks about it. One day, Freyja was wandering around, because apparently goddesses just wander sometimes, and she found a cave. Inside this cave were 4 dwarves, Ulfrig, Dvalin, Berling, and Greyr. The dwarves were master craftsmen, like all dwarves in Norse mythology. They were the ones who made Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Freyja's golden boar, all the legendary treasures of the gods. If you needed something magical and incredible, you went to the dwarves. These 4 were working on a necklace, and it was the most beautiful thing Freyja had ever seen. The name Brísingamen probably means necklace of the Brísings, or possibly fire necklace, because it gleamed like flame and was absolutely covered in gold and jewels. Freyja took one look at it and had to have it. Not wanted, had to have. She asked the dwarves if she could buy it. "Name your price," she said. "Gold, treasures, magical favors, whatever you want." The dwarves looked at each other. Then they looked at Freyja, the most beautiful goddess in all the realms, and they said, "Sure, you can have the necklace. You just have to sleep with each of us. 1 night with each dwarf, 4 nights total, and the necklace is yours." Now, this is the part where a lot of medieval Christian writers who recorded these stories clutched their pearls and called Freyja shameful and wicked. How dare a goddess debase herself with dwarves? How dare she trade sexual favors for jewelry? This is why paganism is wrong. But here's the thing, Freyja is a goddess of fertility and desire. Sex is part of her domain, part of her power. She's not some helpless victim being coerced. She looked at the situation, weighed her options, decided that 4 nights with dwarves was a perfectly acceptable price for the most beautiful necklace in existence, and made the deal. So she did. 4 nights, 4 dwarves, and when it was over, Brísingamen was hers. She put it on and went home to Asgard, probably feeling pretty pleased with herself, except Loki saw her. Loki, the trickster god, the shapeshifter, the giant son who lived among the Aesir and caused more problems than anyone else in the entire pantheon. Loki had been spying on Freyja, because of course he was, and he saw the whole thing. And because Loki cannot resist stirring up trouble, he went straight to Odin and told him everything. Odin was not happy. Not because he cared about Freyja's sex life, really, but because Odin is a control freak who likes to know everything and have power over everyone. The idea that Freyja had gone off and acquired a major magical treasure without his knowledge bothered him, so he told Loki to steal the necklace. Loki, being Loki, accepted the challenge. He snuck into Freyja's hall while she was sleeping. The doors were locked, the windows were sealed, everything was shut tight. So Loki turned himself into a fly, found a tiny gap in the walls, and buzzed inside. Freyja was asleep on her bed, and she was lying on the necklace clasp. The clasp was underneath her, pressed against her neck, and there was no way to undo it without waking her. Loki, still in fly form, circled around trying to figure out what to do. Finally, he bit her on the cheek. Freyja stirred in her sleep and rolled over, exposing the clasp. Loki immediately turned back into his regular form, undid the necklace, and walked out with it. When Freyja woke up and realized Brísingamen was gone, she was furious. She went straight to Odin because who else could have orchestrated this? She demanded her necklace back. Odin, in classic Odin fashion, made her a deal. She could have Brísingamen back, but only if she caused a war. Specifically, she had to make 2 kings fight each other in a never-ending battle, with their warriors dying and being resurrected every day to fight again, over and over, forever. This story is part of a larger myth about the Eithjatningavig, the Battle of the Hedin, which is referenced in several sources but never fully explained. The details are murky, but the point is that Odin, god of war and death, wanted an eternal battle, and he used Freyja's desire for her necklace to get it. Freyja agreed. She got her necklace back, and somewhere 2 kings started fighting a war that would never end. The Norse gods were not what you'd call ethical, but Freyja didn't care. She had Brísingamen and she wore it constantly. It became her symbol, the treasure most associated with her. Later myths mention that she never took it off, that it was part of her identity. The whole story tells us something important about Freyja. She's willing to make deals, even ones that seem questionable. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't feel shame. She decides what she wants, she figures out how to get it, and she moves forward. The medieval Christian writers who recorded these myths were scandalized by her, but the original Viking storytellers probably admired her. After all, the Vikings valued independence and resourcefulness. They also had a much more open attitude towards sex than medieval Christians did. A goddess who knew her own worth and negotiated for what she wanted. That's not shameful, that's powerful. And Freyja was nothing if not powerful. She had her necklace, her magic, her hall full of warriors, her falcon cloak, her cat-drawn chariot. She had everything she needed to be completely independent, which of course meant that various gods and giants kept trying to control her, marry her, or steal her. Because if there's one thing the Norse myths love, it's powerful figures trying to possess beautiful women, and those women finding creative ways to avoid it. Freyja spent a lot of time fending off unwanted marriage proposals. A lot of time. And some of the stories about these proposals are absolutely wild. The giant who built Asgard's wall, one of the most famous stories involving Freyja, is the tale of how Asgard got its defensive wall. It's also a story about how the gods are extremely bad at making decisions and will absolutely throw Freyja under the bus if it means saving themselves. So here's the situation. After the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, Asgard's defenses were in ruins. The walls were broken, the fortifications were destroyed, and the gods were vulnerable to attack from giants, who are constantly trying to invade Asgard and murder everyone. The gods needed a new wall, a massive defensive structure that could keep the giants out. Building a wall around the entire realm of the gods is expensive and time-consuming, and apparently none of the Aesir felt like doing manual labor. They're gods. They have better things to do. Then a stranger showed up. He was riding a massive horse named Svathilfari, and he offered to build them a wall. A perfect, impregnable wall that no giant could ever breach. He could do it in one winter, he said, just a few months of work. The gods were interested. What's the price, they asked. The stranger smiled. He wanted 3 things, the sun, the moon, and Freyja as his wife. The gods immediately said no, absolutely not. You can't have the sun or the moon, the cosmos would fall into chaos. And you definitely can't have Freyja. She's one of the most important goddesses we have. Go away. But Loki, because Loki is always looking for an angle, said, wait, hear me out. What if we agree to his terms, but we set conditions that make it impossible for him to succeed? We tell him he can have his payment, but only if he finishes the wall in one winter with no help from anyone. No human workers, no other giants, just him and his horse. He'll never be able to do it. Walls take years to build. We'll get most of a wall for free, and when he fails to meet the deadline, we don't owe him anything. The gods thought about this. It seemed like a solid plan. Free labor, no payment, and they'd get at least some defensive fortifications out of it. What could go wrong? So they made the deal. The stranger could have the sun, the moon, and Freyja, but only if he finished the entire wall in one winter by himself with no help except from his horse. The stranger agreed, and then he started building. This is where the gods realized they had made a terrible mistake because the stranger was superhumanly fast. He worked day and night, hauling massive boulders like they weighed nothing, and his horse Svathilfari was even more incredible. That horse could drag stones the size of hills. Together, they were building the wall at an impossible pace. Winter started to wind down. The wall was nearly complete. The gods began to panic. They held an emergency council. How did this happen? Who's responsible for this disaster? And everyone immediately turned to Loki because it was his idea. Loki protested. You all agreed to this. You thought it was a great plan, but the gods didn't want to hear it. They told Loki that he had better fix this, or they were going to torture him in ways that would make him wish he'd never been born. Loki, faced with the very real threat of divine violence, came up with a plan. It was a weird plan, a disturbing plan, but it was the only plan he had. That night, when the stranger and his horse Svathilfari were hauling another load of stones, a beautiful mare appeared out of the forest. She whinnied and pranced and generally acted very flirtatious. Svathilfari, who was a stallion, immediately lost interest in hauling rocks. The stranger tried to get his horse back on task, but Svathilfari was already galloping off into the forest after the mare. The stranger ran after them, shouting, but they disappeared into the trees. The mare, of course, was Loki. Loki had turned himself into a female horse to seduce Svathilfari. Yes, really, this is canon Norse mythology. Loki spent the night leading Svathilfari on a chase through the wilderness, and by the time morning came, too much time had been lost. The stranger worked frantically to finish the wall by himself, but without his horse he couldn't do it. The deadline passed. The wall was unfinished. The stranger flew into a rage, and that's when the gods realized he wasn't just some random builder. He was a giant, a Jotun. He'd been disguised as a human this whole time, and now his true form was revealed. The gods, feeling somewhat justified now that they knew they'd been tricked by a giant, called for Thor. Thor showed up with his hammer Mjolnir and immediately smashed the giant's skull in. Problem solved. The giant was dead, the wall was mostly built, and nobody had to give up the sun, the moon, or Freyja. The goddess of desire, let's talk about Freyja's love life, because it's extensive, complicated, and absolutely none of the other gods' business, though that didn't stop them from gossiping about it constantly. Freyja had a reputation. The sources make this very clear. She was associated with love, desire, and sexuality in all its forms. She was invoked in love spells and fertility rituals. Young women prayed to her for good marriages. Men prayed to her for success in seduction. She was the goddess you called on when you wanted someone to notice you, to desire you, to love you back. But Freyja's own romantic life was messy in the way that the love lives of powerful, independent immortals tend to be. She had a missing husband who might have been Odin under another name, or might have been his own separate god, or might have just been a poetic metaphor for the kind of ecstatic inspiration that can't be held onto. She had her 2 daughters, Hnos and Gersimi, who were treasured but rarely mentioned. And then she had lovers, plural, many lovers. The poem Lakkesina, which is basically just Loki crashing a divine dinner party and insulting everyone, includes a section where Loki accuses Freyja of sleeping with every god and elf in the hall. He says she slept with all the gods, including her own brother Freyja. He calls her shameless and corrupt. Freyja's response is essentially, "Shut up, Loki. Everyone knows you're a liar and a troublemaker," which is true. Loki also claims in that same poem that he's the reason Baldur is dead, and that Odin practices unmanly magic, so his credibility is questionable. But the accusation stuck because medieval Christian writers loved it. They used Freyja as an example of pagan moral corruption. Look at these heathens, worshipping a goddess who sleeps around. This is why Christianity is superior, except the original Viking storytellers probably didn't see it that way. Freyja was a fertility goddess. Sex was part of her domain, part of her power. The idea that she would be chaste and virginal would be like expecting Thor to be a pacifist or Odin to be straightforward and honest. It doesn't fit. Freyja had lovers and she didn't apologize for it. The 4 dwarves who made Brísingamen. Possibly her brother Freyja, if you believe Loki's accusations, though that might have been him just trying to be cruel. Various other gods and heroes whose names have been lost to time. And then there's the fascinating story of Adar, one of the human heroes who worshipped her. Adar was a young man with a problem. He was engaged in an inheritance dispute with another man named Angantyr, and the case was going to be decided based on who could recite the longer lineage. Basically, whoever could prove they came from a more distinguished family would win. Adar needed to know his ancestry going back generations, and he didn't have that information, so he prayed to Freyja. He built her a shrine, he made sacrifices, he called on her for help, and Freyja, who apparently liked this young man, decided to help him in the most dramatic way possible. She turned Adar into a boar, a golden boar to be specific, because Freyja doesn't do anything halfway. Then she rode him to the home of a giantess named Hyndla, who was a seeress and knew the genealogies of every family line in the 9 realms. Hyndla was asleep when Freyja arrived, because this was happening in the middle of the night. Freyja woke her up and demanded she recite Adar's ancestry. Hyndla was not pleased. She knew exactly what Freyja was doing. She could see through the boar disguise and recognized Adar. She made some snide comments about how Freyja was riding her lover, and how this was just another one of Freyja's romantic adventures. Freyja didn't deny it. She just told Hyndla to get on with the recitation, or there would be consequences. Hyndla, grumbling, recited Adar's entire family tree. Generations and generations of ancestors, their names, their deeds, their connections to various legendary heroes. It went on for quite a while. When she finished, she tried to go back to sleep, but Freyja demanded more. She wanted Hyndla to give Adar a drink of memory mead, a magical potion that would help him remember everything he'd just heard. Otherwise, what was the point of this whole exercise? Hyndla refused. She said Adar was unworthy, that he was just one of Freyja's many paramours, and that she wasn't going to waste her magic on him. Freyja lost her temper. She threatened to surround Hyndla's cave with magical fire to trap her inside to make her life miserable, and apparently the threat was credible enough that Hyndla gave in. She provided the memory mead, though she tried to curse it first. Freyja caught the curse and neutralized it. Adar drank the mead, remembered his entire genealogy, went to his inheritance hearing, recited all of it perfectly, and won his case. The whole story is wild. Freyja turned a human into a boar, rode him to a giantess's cave in the middle of the night, threatened said giantess with magical fire, and secured magical mead for her worshipper, all because he'd been devoted to her. And yes, Hyndla's accusation that Adar was Freyja's lover is probably true. The poem doesn't confirm it directly, but it's heavily implied. Freyja helped him because she favored him, possibly because they had a relationship and she didn't care what anyone thought about it. This is what makes Freyja such a fascinating figure. She's powerful enough to threaten giants. She's important enough that half the slain warriors come to her hall. She teaches magic to Odin himself, but she's also deeply involved with humanity. She has favorites. She helps them. She loves them in whatever way a goddess loves mortals. The Vikings understood that their gods weren't distant or pure or above human concerns. Their gods were powerful and dangerous and immortal, yes, but they also had desires, preferences, feuds, and lovers. They were beings you could potentially bargain with, pray to, build relationships with. Freyja especially seemed to care about her worshippers. Women prayed to her for help with love and childbirth. Men prayed to her for courage in battle and favor in romance. She was invoked in wedding ceremonies and fertility rituals. She was part of people's everyday lives, but she was also unpredictable. She could be generous and kind, or she could be fierce and demanding. She rewarded devotion, but she also expected respect. You didn't command Freyja. You asked and hoped she was in the mood to help. The other gods seemed to understand this. They respected her even when they didn't fully understand her. Odin learned magic from her. Thor defended her when giants tried to kidnap her. Even Loki, who insulted everyone, seemed to recognize that Freyja was someone you didn't push too far. And then there were the stories about her and Odin specifically, because their relationship was complicated in ways that the myths only hint at. Freyja and the All-Father Freyja's relationship with Odin is one of the most interesting and least explained dynamics in Norse mythology. They're both magic users. They both claim portions of the slain. They both have aspects of wisdom, prophecy, and power that seem to overlap, and the sources hint that they might have been lovers or rivals or both. Some scholars think Freyja and Frigg, Odin's wife, might have originally been the same goddess who split into 2 different figures as the myths developed over time. Frigg is associated with domestic matters, marriage, motherhood, and weaving fate. Freyja is associated with passion, war, magic, and independence. They're similar enough that confusion is understandable, especially since both of them know things they shouldn't and both of them have connections to women's magic and prophecy. But in the myths as we have them, they're separate goddesses. Frigg is Odin's wife, the queen of Asgard, the mother of Balder. Freyja is the Vanir goddess who lives in her own hall and does her own thing. And yet, there are hints. Odin has many names, over 200 of them in various poems and sagas. One of those names is Other, which is also the name of Freyja's missing husband. Other means frenzy, inspiration, fury, the kind of ecstatic state that comes with battle rage or poetic composition or prophetic vision. It's the root of the word Odin itself. So either Freyja's husband Other was actually Odin traveling under another name, or Other was his own separate god who was so similar to Odin that they eventually got conflated, or the whole thing is a poetic metaphor about how inspiration and ecstasy can't be possessed or held onto. The myths don't clarify. They just mention that Other left, that Freyja wept golden tears, that she traveled the 9 realms searching for him under different names. Some versions say she found him eventually, in distant lands. Others say she's still searching. If Other was Odin, this adds a whole new layer to Freyja's presence in Asgard. She'd be living in the same realm as her absent husband, watching him rule as king with another wife, claiming her share of the dead while he claims his. It would be a relationship defined by distance and separation, even when they're in the same place. There's also the matter of seiðr magic. Freyja taught it to Odin, which means she was his teacher in something fundamental. Seiðr wasn't just fortune-telling or simple spells. It was the magic of shaping fate itself, of seeing possible futures and changing them. It involved trance states, spirit journeys, communicating with the dead. It was powerful and dangerous, and according to Viking gender norms, inappropriate for men. But Odin didn't care about gender norms when power was involved. He learned seiðr from Freyja and he practiced it, even though it meant being called ergi, unmanly, shameful. He hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of the runes. He sacrificed an eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He did whatever it took to gain more knowledge, more power. Freyja taught him something he couldn't learn anywhere else. That put her in a position of power over the All-Father, at least in that one domain. He was her student. She was his teacher. This might explain why Odin never tried to control Freyja the way he controlled other gods. He commanded armies, orchestrated events, manipulated fate itself. But Freyja did what she wanted. She kept her independence. She stayed in her own hall, claimed her own warriors, practiced her own magic. Maybe Odin knew better than to try to control someone who understood power the way she did. There's a story fragmentary, only partially preserved, about a time when Freyja and Odin competed over a battle. This was the thing they shared. They both claimed the slain. Odin wanted warriors for Valhalla, for his army that would fight at Ragnarok. Freyja wanted warriors for Sessrumnir, for reasons the myths never fully explain. In this particular battle, both gods had champions fighting on opposite sides. They each used their magic to try to ensure their champion won. The battle raged for days. Neither side could gain a permanent advantage, because every time one champion seemed about to win, the other god would intervene with magic or manipulation. Finally, one of them, the sources don't agree on which, did something underhanded that decided the battle. The other god was furious. There was a confrontation. The exact details are lost, but the implication is that Freyja and Odin's conflict over the slain was intense and ongoing. They were colleagues, possibly former lovers, definitely magical rivals. They respected each other's power but competed for the same resource, the souls of dead warriors. It's a strange dynamic. In most mythologies, death gods are solitary figures. They claim all the dead, or at least all the dead of a certain type. But the Norse split it down the middle. Odin gets half, Freyja gets half. They're equals in this one crucial domain. That equality might be the key to understanding their relationship. Odin was the All-Father, the king of the gods, the most powerful figure in Asgard. But Freyja was the only one who could match him in certain areas. She knew magic he had to learn from her. She claimed warriors he couldn't have. She was independent in a way that even Frigg wasn't. Odin collected knowledge, power, and secrets, but he couldn't collect Freyja. The Völva and the prophecy, one of the most important aspects of Freyja's power was her connection to the Völar, the seeresses who practiced seiðr magic throughout the Viking world. These were real women, historically documented, who traveled from settlement to settlement performing rituals, making prophecies, and communicating with spirits. The Völar were both respected and feared. They could see the future. They could curse enemies. They could speak with the dead. They operated outside normal social hierarchies. They weren't wives or mothers in the traditional sense. They didn't weave or keep house. They wandered and practiced magic and answered to no one except the spirits they served. Freyja was their patron goddess. She was the first Völva, the one who brought seiðr magic to the world. When Viking women went into trance states to see the future, they were channeling Freyja's power. There's a saga, the Saga of Eric the Red, that describes a Völva's visit to a Greenland settlement. She arrived wearing specific clothing, a blue cloak with stones set into the hem, a necklace of glass beads, a hood lined with white cat fur. She carried a staff decorated with brass and jewels. She sat in a high seat while the settlement's women gathered around her. They sang something called the Varlokr, the spirit songs that called the spirits and opened the way for prophecy. The Völva went into a trance. She spoke with spirits. She answered questions about the coming year, about harvests and fortunes and deaths. Everything about this ritual was connected to Freyja. The blue cloak, blue was Freyja's color. the necklace echoing Brísingamen. The cat fur cats were Freyja's sacred animals. The high seat, a position of honor and power. The female community singing together, women's magic, women's knowledge. The Vurler were performing Freyja's magic, using Freyja's methods, channeling Freyja's power to see what was hidden and speak what was true. And the things they saw were often terrible. The most famous prophecy in Norse mythology is the Vurlespa, the prophecy of the Seiðr. It's a poem that describes the entire history of the cosmos from creation to Ragnarok, the end of everything. A Vurlva speaks it, and scholars debate whether she's meant to be Freyja herself, or one of Freyja's human Seiðrs, or some other prophetic figure entirely. Whoever she is, she knows everything. She knows how the world was made from the body of the giant Ymir. She knows about the creation of humans, the planting of Yggdrasil, the war between the Aesir and Vanir. She knows about Baldur's death, the binding of Loki, the coming of Ragnarok. She describes the end in detail, the breaking of all bonds, the rising of the dead, the march of giants and monsters against the gods. She sees Odin fall to the wolf Fenrir. She sees Thor kill the Midgard serpent and die from its poison. She sees the world burn and sink into the sea. And then she sees what comes after, a new world, rising from the water, green and beautiful. Two humans emerging from hiding to repopulate the earth. A new sun, daughter of the old sun, taking her mother's path across the sky. Destruction and then renewal, that's the pattern. Freyja, as the goddess of seiðr, would have known all of this. She would have seen Ragnarok coming, seen the deaths of the gods she lived among, seen the end of the 9 realms. And she would have known there was nothing she could do to stop it. That's the tragedy of prophecy in Norse mythology. You can see the future, but you can't change it. Fate is fixed. The Norns, the 3 women who weave destiny at the base of Yggdrasil, have already woven what will be. Seiðr can show you what's coming, but it can't alter the pattern. Odin knew this too. He sought knowledge everywhere, sacrificed everything for it, learned magic from Freyja specifically so he could see the future. And what did he see? His own death, the death of his sons, the end of Asgard. He knew, and he still prepared. He still gathered warriors in Valhalla. He still orchestrated events, made alliances, sought advantages. Maybe he thought he could change fate despite everything. Or maybe he just refused to go down without fighting. Freyja's response to knowing the future is never explicitly described. The myths don't tell us how she felt about the coming end. Did she share Odin's defiance? Did she rage against fate? Did she accept it with resignation? We don't know, but we know she kept claiming her warriors. She kept filling her hall in Fólkvangr. She kept teaching magic, accepting prayers, helping her worshippers. She kept being Freyja. Maybe that's its own form of defiance. Maybe continuing to be yourself, to love and desire and fight and weep and claim your power, even when you know it's all going to end. Maybe that's the most Freyja thing possible. The Vurler who channeled her power were doing the same thing. They saw futures that couldn't be changed. They warned people of coming disasters. They spoke truths that no one wanted to hear. And they kept doing it because the truth matters even when it's terrible. The tears of gold, let's go back to Other, the missing husband, because his absence defines so much of who Freyja is. The poems say Freyja wept tears of red gold, not metaphorical tears, actual gold. When she cried, gold dripped from her eyes and fell to the earth. Some versions say the gold fell into the sea and became amber, which washes up on beaches and glows like frozen sunlight. She wept because Other left. He went traveling to distant lands and he didn't come back, so Freyja went searching for him. She took many names during her search. The poems list them: Mardel, sea brightener, because her golden tears lit up the ocean; Hern, possibly meaning flax or connected to some other aspect of fertility; Jeffin, giver; Sir, sow, connecting her to her sacred animal, the boar. Each name was a different aspect of her grief and her searching. Each name was a mask she wore in different lands, asking different peoples if they'd seen her husband, if they knew where he'd gone. Some versions of the story say she found him, eventually, in distant southern lands. They reunited, but the reunion was temporary. Other always left again. The leaving was his nature, his essence. He was frenzy and inspiration, the thing that can't be held. Other versions say she never found him. She's still searching, still weeping, still dropping gold wherever she goes. Either way, it's a story about loss, about loving something that can't stay, about continuing to search even when you suspect the search is pointless. The Vikings understood this kind of grief. They lived in a world where people left on voyages and never came back. Ships sank, raiders struck, winters were brutal, loss was constant. The idea of a goddess who grieved, who wept, who searched for someone she loved, that was relatable. But Freyja's grief was also generative. Her tears became treasure. Her searching took her to all corners of the earth, spreading her worship, sharing her magic. Her loss made her wander, and her wandering made her accessible to more people. There's something profound in that. The idea that grief doesn't just destroy, it also creates. It transforms. The pain becomes something else, something that has value. The Vikings made art about this. Brooches and pendants shaped like crying eyes, meant to invoke Freyja's tears and her blessing. Amber beads strung into necklaces, each one supposedly formed from her grief. Poetry that compared beautiful things to her tears, making sadness and beauty inseparable. Freyja's tears also connected her to another aspect of her mythology, her association with gold. She loves gold more than almost anything. Her hall is described as golden. Her necklace Brísingamen gleams like fire. She wears golden jewelry, rides in a golden chariot, owns golden treasures. Some scholars think this obsession with gold connects her to the earth itself, to the minerals buried in soil and stone. She's a Vanir goddess, and the Vanir are earth deities, gods of growth and fertility and the treasures that come from the ground. Freyja's gold love might be an expression of her connection to the physical world, to material abundance. But there's also something about the tears specifically. Gold that comes from weeping is different from gold you mine or steal or trade for. It's gold created through emotion, through loss. It's precious not just because it's valuable, but because it costs something to make. Freyja's tears are the price of her love. They're what remains when the beloved is gone, and they're beautiful, which is its own kind of tragedy. The myths don't moralize about this. They don't say Freyja should get over it, move on, stop crying. They just acknowledge that this is who she is, someone who loves deeply, who loses, who grieves, and whose grief becomes treasure. Cats, boars, and falcons, we should talk about Freyja's animals, because they're all extremely specific and tell us a lot about her various aspects. First, the cats. Freyja rides in a chariot pulled by two large cats. The sources usually describe them as gib cats, which probably means tomcats, but they're clearly magical and enormous, large enough to pull a chariot carrying a goddess. Cats weren't exactly common in Viking Scandinavia. They existed, but they weren't the ubiquitous household pets they are today. Having cats, especially large ones, pulling your chariot was a distinctly weird choice, but it makes sense for Freyja. Cats are independent. They can't be commanded the way dogs or horses can. They do what they want when they want, and they only cooperate if they feel like it. That's very on brand for a goddess who values autonomy and refuses to be controlled. Cats are also associated with women's spaces. They live in houses near hearths in domestic areas that were traditionally women's domains, but they're also hunters. They kill. They're predators with claws and teeth, cute and deadly at the same time. Freyja is the same way. She's beautiful and desirable, yes, but she's also dangerous. She's a goddess of love who's also a goddess of war. She attracts and she destroys. The cats fit perfectly. There's also a practical element. Vurlur, the seeresses who practiced Freyja's magic, often wore cat fur trim on their clothing. It was part of their ritual gear, marking them as practitioners of women's magic, as followers of Freyja. Cats were Freyja's sacred animals, and wearing their fur connected you to her power. Then there's the boar. Freyja's brother Freyja has a golden boar named Gullinbursti, golden bristled, that can run faster than any horse and glows in the dark. Freyja also has a boar named Hildisvini, battle swine. She rode it to visit the giantess Hyndla, though Hildisvini was actually Adar in disguise at the time. Boars were important in Norse culture. They were symbols of fertility and prosperity. They were also fierce fighters. Anyone who's encountered an angry boar knows they're fast, aggressive, and equipped with tusks that can gore you. Viking warriors sometimes wore boar-crested helmets into battle. Freyja's connection to boars ties her to both fertility and battle. She's a Vanir goddess concerned with growth and abundance, but she's also a warrior deity who claims the slain. The boar represents both aspects, the fertile animal that produces many offspring and the dangerous beast that fights to the death. And then there's the falcon cloak. Freyja's feather cloak, made from falcon skins, allows whoever wears it to fly. Loki borrows it frequently. He uses it to fly to Jotunheim to investigate Thor's stolen hammer. He uses it for various other schemes. The cloak is one of Freyja's most powerful magical items. Falcons are birds of prey. They're hunters, fast and deadly. They fly high and see everything. They strike from above with precision. The ability to fly, to transform, to see from a different perspective. That's classic seiðr magic. Shape-shifting and spirit journeys were part of what the Vurlur did. The falcon cloak is a physical manifestation of that power, the ability to leave your ordinary form, to soar above the world, to go places you couldn't otherwise reach. Freyja loans the cloak out sometimes, which is interesting. She's possessive about Brísingamen. The necklace is hers and hers alone, but the falcon cloak she shares. Maybe because flight is meant to be shared. Maybe because transformation magic is something that should spread. Or maybe she just likes watching Loki get into trouble. Each animal, cats, boars, falcons, represents a different aspect of Freyja. Independence and domesticity in hunting, fertility in battle, transformation in sight. She's all of these things at once, and she refuses to be reduced to just one. The gods of other mythologies often have one sacred animal. Zeus has eagles, Athena has owls, Aphrodite has doves. But Freyja has cats and boars and falcons, and also sometimes she has warriors, and also she has the Vurlur, and also she has anyone who prays to her for love or magic or courage. She's too big to be contained in a single symbol. The Horn of Mead, there's a smaller story about Freyja that doesn't get mentioned as often, but it's worth telling because it shows her sense of humor and her willingness to get involved in ridiculous situations. One time the gods were having a feast because the gods are always having feasts. Odin was presiding as usual, being all-knowing and mysterious. The other gods were drinking mead and telling stories and generally enjoying themselves. A giant named Hrungnir showed up. How he got into Asgard is unclear. The sources gloss over this detail. Maybe he was invited. Maybe he just barged in. Giants have a habit of appearing where they're not wanted. Hrungnir started drinking and drinking and drinking. He got extremely drunk, the kind of drunk where you start saying things you probably shouldn't. He started bragging about how strong he was. Then he started threatening the gods. He said he was going to carry off Asgard itself and sink it into the sea. He was going to kill all the male gods, and he was going to take Freyja and Sif, Thor's wife, home with him as prizes. The gods were not amused, but Hrungnir was a guest, technically, and there were rules about hospitality. You couldn't just kill a guest in your hall, even if that guest was being an aggressive drunk. So someone, and the sources say it was Freyja, kept serving him mead, more and more mead. She kept his cup full, encouraging him to drink, being the perfect hostess while this giant threatened to kidnap her. Hrungnir kept drinking and kept boasting. He was going to destroy everything. He was going to take the goddesses. He was invincible. Finally, Thor showed up. Thor had been away doing Thor things, probably killing giants somewhere else. He came into the hall, saw a drunk giant threatening his wife and talking about kidnapping Freyja, and immediately raised Mjolnir. The other gods stopped him. "You can't kill a guest," they said. "Sacred hospitality. We have rules." Thor was furious, but he agreed. Instead, he challenged Hrungnir to a duel. "Meet me at the border between Asgard and Jotunheim," he said. "We'll fight properly like men, and I'll kill you there." Hrungnir, still drunk, agreed. He staggered out of the hall and went back to Jotunheim to prepare. The duel happened. Thor killed Hrungnir, though it was a closer fight than expected. Hrungnir threw a giant whetstone that embedded itself in Thor's skull, and it stayed there for the rest of his life. But Hrungnir died, the threat was over, and Freyja never had to worry about being kidnapped by that particular giant. What's interesting about this story is Freyja's role. She didn't cower or beg for rescue. She served the giant mead. She played the gracious hostess while he threatened her, possibly because she knew the rules of hospitality would protect everyone until Thor arrived. Or maybe she was just making sure Hrungnir got drunk enough that he'd be easier to kill later. Either way, it's a small story, barely a footnote in the larger mythology, but it shows Freyja's practical side. She's not always doing dramatic magic or weeping golden tears. Sometimes she's just dealing with drunk giants at parties and making sure the situation doesn't explode until someone can handle it properly. It's very human in a way. The goddess of love and war, stuck playing hostess to an aggressive drunk, waiting for rescue, but also managing the situation herself in the meantime. The gods weren't always battling monsters and making prophecies. Sometimes they were just getting through the day. Freyja, for her part, was probably extremely angry that the gods had even considered trading her away. The sources don't record her reaction, but given her personality, she definitely had words for Odin and the rest of the council. "You were going to give me to a giant to save money on construction costs." Really, but the story doesn't end there. A few months later, Loki showed up again, and he was accompanied by a foal, an 8-legged foal. This was Sleipnir, the result of Loki's. With Svathilfari, Loki had given birth to an 8-legged horse, the fastest steed in all the 9 realms. He gave Sleipnir to Odin, who accepted this extremely strange gift and made the horse his personal mount. So to recap, the gods almost traded Freyja, the sun, and the moon to a giant for a wall. Loki saved them by turning into a horse and getting pregnant. Thor killed the giant, and Odin got an 8-legged horse out of the whole mess. Freyja, understandably, was not thrilled about any of this. She had nearly been given away like property, and the gods didn't seem particularly apologetic about it. This wasn't the last time they'd tried to trade her to a giant, either. The gods had a bad habit of using Freyja as a bargaining chip. The theft of Mjolnir, the next time the gods tried to trade Freyja to a giant, it was even more absurd, and it involved Thor's hammer. Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, was the most powerful weapon in Asgard. It could level mountains, kill giants with a single blow, and always return to Thor's hand when thrown. It was also the primary defense against the giants who constantly threatened to invade and destroy the gods. Without Mjolnir, Asgard was vulnerable. One morning, Thor woke up and his hammer was gone. He tore apart his room looking for it. He searched all of Asgard. He questioned everyone. Nothing. Mjolnir had vanished. Thor went to Loki because Loki always knows what's happening in the 9 realms, usually because he caused it. Loki, for once, had nothing to do with this particular theft, but he agreed to help investigate. He borrowed Freyja's falcon cloak, the magical cloak that lets the wearer fly, and soared off to Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. He found the culprit almost immediately. A giant named Thrym was sitting on a burial mound, braiding gold into his horse's manes and looking extremely pleased with himself. Loki landed, transformed back into his usual shape, and asked if Thrym had seen Thor's hammer. Thrym grinned. "Oh, I've seen it. I've got it. I buried it 8 miles underground where no one will ever find it." Loki asked what it would take to get the hammer back. Thrym's answer: "I want Freyja as my wife. Bring her to me, dressed as a bride, and I'll return Mjolnir." Loki flew back to Asgard and reported this to the gods. The gods held another council. This was a crisis. Without Mjolnir, they were defenseless. The giants could attack at any moment. They needed that hammer back. Someone suggested they should just give Thrym what he wanted. Send Freyja to Jotunheim, get the hammer, figure out the rest later. Freyja's response to this suggestion was immediate and volcanic. She was so angry that the entire hall shook. Her necklace Brísingamen snapped off her neck and hit the floor. She told the gods in no uncertain terms that she would not be marrying a giant. She would not be traded away like livestock. She would not be used as a bargaining chip to fix their problems. Absolutely not. The gods, faced with an enraged Freyja and no other ideas, started panicking. What were they supposed to do? They needed the hammer. Thrym wouldn't budge. Then Heimdall, the watchman god who guards the Bifrost Bridge, had an idea. It was a ridiculous idea, but it was the only idea anyone had. What if they dressed Thor up as Freyja? Everyone stared at him. Think about it, Heimdall said. Thor goes to Jotunheim disguised as a bride. We send Loki with him, dressed as a bridesmaid. They go to the wedding, and as soon as Thrym brings out Mjolnir to bless the marriage, because that's tradition, Thor grabs it and kills everyone. There was a long silence. Thor was absolutely against this plan. He was the manliest of all the gods. He had a giant red beard. He killed giants with his bare hands. He was not putting on a wedding dress, but Loki pointed out that they didn't have any other options. It was either this or Asgard falls to the giants. Reluctantly, very, very reluctantly, Thor agreed. They dressed him in a bride's gown. They put a veil over his face. They hung Brísingamen around his neck, which Freyja was definitely not happy about. They jingled keys at his belt, because that's what Norse brides wore to symbolize their authority over the household. Thor looked absolutely ridiculous. Loki, dressed as a bridesmaid, looked like he was having the time of his life. They traveled to Jotunheim, to Thrym's hall, where the giant had prepared a massive wedding feast. Thrym was delighted. Finally, the most beautiful goddess in all the realms was going to be his wife. They sat down to eat. Immediately, things started going wrong. Thor, because he's Thor, ate an entire ox by himself. Then he ate 8 salmon. Then he drank 3 barrels of mead. Thrym watched this with growing alarm. Your bride has quite an appetite, he said to Loki. Loki, thinking fast, said, oh, well, she was so excited about this wedding that she hasn't eaten in 8 days. She's been fasting in anticipation. Thrym accepted this explanation. He leaned over to kiss his bride, lifted the veil slightly, and saw Thor's eyes glaring at him with barely contained rage. He jumped back. Why are her eyes so terrifying? They look like they're burning with fire. Loki jumped in again. Oh, that's because she hasn't slept in 8 nights. She was so excited to marry you that she couldn't rest. Thrym, who apparently was not very bright, believed this too. He called for the wedding to proceed. Following tradition, he brought out Mjolnir and placed it in the bride's lap to bless the union. The second the hammer touched Thor's hand, he ripped off the veil, grabbed Mjolnir, and started killing everyone in the hall. Thrym died first, then all his relatives, then everyone else at the wedding. Thor and Loki left Jotunheim, leaving nothing but corpses behind. They returned to Asgard victorious. Thor had his hammer back, Freyja got her necklace back, and everyone agreed to never speak of the fact that Thor had spent an evening in a wedding dress. Freyja once again had narrowly avoided being traded to a giant, and once again she hadn't needed to do anything herself. The gods' schemes had fallen apart on their own, and violence had solved the problem. But the fact that this kept happening, that the gods kept trying to use her as payment or bait, says something about her position. She was valuable, she was desired, and she was constantly having to assert her autonomy in a world that wanted to control her. The myths make it clear that Freyja was not passive. When the gods suggested giving her away, she didn't quietly accept it. She raged, she refused. She made it clear that she belonged to herself, not to Asgard, not to Odin, not to anyone. That's rare in mythology. A lot of goddesses in various cultures are defined by their relationships to male gods, their wives, mothers, daughters, and not much else. Freyja is defined by her own power, her own desires, and her own choices. Which brings us to another aspect of Freyja's mythology, her many lovers. The wedding at Midgard, there's another wedding story involving Freyja, though this time she's not the one being threatened with marriage. Instead, she's helping a mortal woman, which is one of the quieter but more consistent aspects of her mythology. A young woman. The sagas don't always give us names for mortal women, which is frustrating but typical, was supposed to marry a man she didn't love. The marriage had been arranged by her family for political or financial reasons, the way most marriages were in Viking society. The woman was miserable about it. She prayed to Freyja. She made offerings at Freyja's shrine, which would have been a carved wooden figure or maybe just a special stone in a sacred grove. She asked for help, for some way out of this marriage that wouldn't shame her family or ruin her life. Freyja appeared to her in a dream. This is how gods usually communicated with mortals, through dreams, visions, moments of inspiration that could be divine intervention or could just be your imagination. The line was blurry. In the dream, Freyja told the woman to go to the wedding as planned, but to wear a specific necklace. Not Brísingamen, that was Freyja's alone, but a particular amber necklace that the woman owned, a family heirloom. The woman did as instructed. She wore the necklace to the wedding feast. And during the feast, the groom-to-be saw the necklace and became convinced that the woman was a Völva, a seeress, someone touched by Freyja's magic. He was terrified. Viking men were often afraid of women who practiced seiðr because that magic could curse you, could see your secrets, could control you in ways that physical strength couldn't fight against. The groom called off the wedding on the spot, claiming he wouldn't marry a witch. The woman's family was furious at him for breaking the contract. The woman was released from the obligation. She eventually married someone else, someone she actually wanted. Whether Freyja actually intervened or whether the woman just took advantage of Viking superstition is never clarified. Maybe the necklace really did carry Freyja's power. Maybe the woman's prayer gave her the confidence to wear it in a way that suggested magic. Maybe the groom was just looking for an excuse to back out, and the necklace provided it. The sagas don't care about explaining the mechanism. They just record that the woman prayed, Freyja answered, and the problem was solved. This is the kind of story that rarely makes it into modern retellings of Norse mythology because it's small and domestic and doesn't involve any battles or monsters. But it's important because it shows how ordinary people related to Freyja. She wasn't just the goddess of grand cosmic events. She was the goddess you prayed to when you had a problem with love or marriage or desire, when you wanted someone to notice you, or when you wanted someone to leave you alone, when you needed courage or cunning or just a bit of luck. Women especially prayed to her. Young women who wanted good marriages, married women who wanted children, older women who practiced magic and needed her blessing. Freyja was present in women's lives in a way that the male gods often weren't. This doesn't mean men didn't worship her. They did. Warriors prayed to her before battle, hoping to die well enough to be chosen for her hall. Men who wanted success in love made offerings to her. But there was something specifically feminine about Freyja's worship, something tied to women's experiences and women's power. The Völvar who practiced her magic were women. The seiðr rituals involved women's voices, women's knowledge. Domestic shrines where people made everyday offerings were maintained by women. Freyja was woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that Odin or Thor, for all their power, weren't, and she responded. The sagas are full of small stories about people who prayed to Freyja and got help. Sometimes the help was dramatic, visions, transformations, magical interventions. Sometimes it was subtle, a dream that gave you an idea, a coincidence that worked in your favor, a moment of courage when you needed it most. The gods weren't distant in Norse belief. They were active, involved, paying attention. Freyja especially seemed to care about her worshippers, to listen to their prayers, to intervene when she thought it was warranted. Or maybe people just attributed their good fortune to her after the fact. Maybe when things worked out, they said Freyja must have helped. Maybe when they wore amber and felt beautiful, they said it was Freyja's blessing. Maybe when they found courage to stand up for themselves, they said Freyja gave them strength. The line between divine intervention and human agency was never clear, but that ambiguity was part of the relationship. You prayed, you made offerings, you honored the gods, and then you acted. The gods helped those who helped themselves. The end of all things we need to talk about Ragnarok, because Freyja's role in the end of the world is barely mentioned, and that absence is significant. Ragnarok is the Norse apocalypse. It's been prophesied since the beginning of time. The Völva who speaks the Völuspá has seen it all: the breaking of bonds, the rising of monsters, the death of gods. First, there will be 3 winters with no summer in between. Fimbulwinter, they call it. Cold and darkness and starvation. Humanity will turn on itself. Brother will kill brother. The bonds of kinship will mean nothing. Then the monsters will break free. Fenrir, the giant wolf, will break his chains and run free. He's been bound since he was a puppy because the gods knew he would eventually kill Odin. They fed him, raised him, and then betrayed him when he grew too large and too dangerous. They tricked him into wearing a magical chain that he couldn't break, and they've kept him bound ever since. But at Ragnarok, the chain will snap. Fenrir will be free, and he will be hungry for revenge. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, Thor's eternal enemy, will rise from the ocean. He's so large he encircles the entire world, holding his tail in his mouth. When he lets go and rises up, the seas will flood the land. Poison will drip from his fangs and fill the sky. Loki will break free from his own chains. The gods bound him after he caused Baldur's death, tied him to rocks with the entrails of his own son, placed a serpent above him to drip venom on his face. His wife Sigyn catches the venom in a bowl, but when she has to empty it, the venom falls on Loki and he writhes in agony, causing earthquakes. At Ragnarok, those bonds will break. Loki will lead the giants and the dead in an army against the gods. Heimdall the Watchman will blow his horn. The sound will carry across all the 9 realms. The gods will know the time has come. They'll ride out from Asgard to meet the enemy. Odin will lead the Einherjar, the warriors from Valhalla, the ones he's been collecting and training for exactly this moment. They'll fight, they'll die. Odin will face Fenrir. The wolf will swallow him whole. Odin's son Vidar will avenge him, tearing Fenrir's jaws apart, but Odin will still be dead. Thor will fight Jörmungandr. They're destined enemies, fated to kill each other. Thor will crush the serpent's skull with Mjolnir, and the serpent's poison will kill him. He'll take 9 steps back from the serpent's corpse and then fall dead. Freyja's brother, will fight the fire giant seiðr. Freyja will die because he gave away his magic sword long ago, traded it for a chance to marry the woman he loved. He'll die because he chose love over survival. Loki and Heimdall will kill each other. The gods and giants will slaughter each other. The world will burn. Seiðr's flames will consume everything. The earth will sink into the sea. Everything will end. And Freyja. She's not mentioned. Her role in Ragnarok is never described. We don't know if she fights or flees or dies or survives. Some scholars think this absence is significant. Maybe Freyja, as a Vanir goddess, isn't bound by the same fate as the Aesir. The Vanir are older, more connected to the earth itself, to cycles of death and rebirth. Maybe she returns to whatever realm the Vanir came from originally. Other scholars think the sources are just incomplete. The poems we have are fragments, pieces of a larger story that was never fully written down. Maybe there were verses about Freyja at Ragnarok that got lost, or maybe her absence is the point. Freyja has always been somewhat outside the main story of the Aesir gods. She came to Asgard as a hostage, as part of a peace treaty. She kept her own hall, her own warriors, her own magic. She was never fully part of Odin's plans. Maybe at Ragnarok, she's somewhere else. Maybe she's in Fólkvangr with her half of the slain, waiting for the end to pass. Maybe she knew all along, through her seiðr magic, that this was coming, and she prepared differently than Odin did. Odin prepared for war. He gathered an army, trained them, hoarded them in Valhalla for the final battle. He did everything he could to fight fate, even though he knew it was hopeless. Freyja prepared by teaching magic, by claiming her warriors, by being present in people's lives. Maybe her response to the end of the world was to focus on beauty and love and desire while they still existed. Maybe she wept her golden tears knowing it would all burn and created treasure from that grief anyway. We don't know. The myths don't tell us, but we do know what comes after. After Ragnarok, after the fire and the flood, a new world rises from the sea. Green and beautiful, fertile and clean. A few gods survive. Baldur returns from the dead, having been held in hell all this time. Odin's sons Modi and Magni survive. Honir survives. They gather in the place where Asgard used to stand. 2 humans emerge from hiding, Lif and Lifthrasir, Life and Leifjörnr. They survive by hiding in Hodmamis Holt, the wood of Hodmamis, wherever that was. They'll repopulate the earth, start humanity over. A new sun appears, daughter of the old sun. She'll follow her mother's path across the sky, bringing light to the new world. And somewhere in this new world, growing in the grass, the gods find golden game pieces. These were the pieces the gods used to play with in the old world before everything ended. Finding them again means continuity, memory, connection to what was lost. Is Freyja in this new world? The sources don't say. But if the pattern holds, if the gods who represent older powers, earth powers, fertility and growth and the cycle of seasons, if those gods survive while the war gods die, then maybe she's there. Maybe Freyja is one of the gods who walks in the new green world, wearing Brísingamen, remembering everything that was lost, ready to start again. Or maybe she's still searching for other and distant lands, still weeping tears of gold, still claiming warriors for Sessrumnir in whatever realm exists beyond the end of the world. The myths don't give us closure. They give us fragments, possibilities, hints. Freyja remains mysterious, powerful, just slightly outside the main narrative, even at the end of everything. Freyja in Midgard, let's talk about how Freyja interacted with the human world, because this is where her mythology gets deeply personal and strange. Freyja didn't just stay in Asgard dealing with gods and giants. She wandered. She traveled through Midgard, the realm of humans, taking different forms and different names. Sometimes people recognized her, sometimes they didn't. There's a story about a farmer who found a beautiful woman sleeping in his barn. She was wearing fine clothes, though they were travel-stained and muddy. She had amber beads around her neck. She woke when he approached, and her eyes were the color of honey. The farmer, being a decent person, offered her food and shelter. His wife was suspicious. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? Why was she alone? But the farmer insisted on hospitality. You don't turn away travelers, especially not in the middle of nowhere, especially not in winter. The woman stayed for 3 days. She didn't say much about herself. She helped around the farm, though her hands were too soft for farm work and she clearly wasn't used to it. The farmer's wife watched her constantly, trying to figure out what her deal was. On the 3rd night, the farmer's wife had a dream. In the dream, a voice told her, "You're hosting Freyja. Treat her with honor. Ask her for a blessing before she leaves." The wife woke up terrified. Was the woman really a goddess? How could you tell? What if the dream was wrong and she insulted a normal traveler by treating her like a deity? But in the morning, when the woman prepared to leave, the farmer's wife knelt and asked for a blessing. The woman smiled, a strange, knowing smile, and touched the wife's belly. "You'll have a daughter," she said. "She'll be beautiful and wise, and she'll see things others don't." Then she left, walking into the forest, and they never saw her again. 9 months later, the farmer's wife had a daughter. The daughter grew up to be a Verolva, a seeress. She traveled throughout the region performing prophecies and magic, and she always wore amber beads exactly like the ones the strange woman had worn. Was the woman really Freyja? The saga doesn't confirm it, but the implication is clear enough. Freyja traveled in disguise, testing people's hospitality, blessing those who treated her well. This is a common theme in Norse stories about the gods. They wander in disguise, appearing as beggars or travelers or strangers in need. How you treat them reveals your character. The gods remember kindness and they reward it, but they also remember cruelty. There's a darker version of this story about a jarl, a nobleman who turned away a woman seeking shelter. She was muddy and tired, and he didn't want her in his hall. He told his servants to give her food and send her away. The woman cursed him. Not loudly or dramatically. She just looked at him and said, "You'll have no sons. Your line will end with you." And it did. The jarl's wife never conceived. They tried everything, prayers, offerings, rituals, nothing worked. The jarl died without an heir, and his lands were divided among distant relatives. Was it Freyja he turned away? The saga implies it, but doesn't state it outright. Maybe it was just a woman with some magical ability who cursed him. Maybe it was coincidence and the jarl was already infertile, but people believed it was Freyja. They told the story as a warning: be kind to strangers. You never know who they might be. The gods are watching and they care about how you treat the vulnerable. This made Freyja accessible in a way that Odin or Thor weren't. Odin might appear as a mysterious wanderer, yes, but he was testing your wisdom or trying to manipulate you into starting wars. Thor was off fighting giants. They were powerful but distant. Freyja walked among humans. She blessed their children. She cursed their enemies. She cared about hospitality and kindness and how you treated women. The common people loved her for it. Noble families might worship Odin and warrior clans might honor Thor, but ordinary farmers and craftspeople and merchants prayed to Freyja. She was present in their lives in immediate, tangible ways. The magic of women lets go deeper into seiðr, because it's central to understanding Freyja's power and also deeply weird by Viking standards. Seiðr was women's magic. The practitioners were almost always female, the Vurlur, the seeresses, the wise women who traveled from place to place. There were male practitioners occasionally, but they were rare and often viewed with suspicion. The magic involved several specific practices: prophecy, spirit journeys, cursing, blessing, shaping luck and fate. A Vurlva would sit in a high seat while other women sang the Vardlokr, the spirit songs that opened the way between worlds. She'd go into a trance. Her spirit would leave her body and travel. Where did it go? The sources aren't specific. To the realm of the dead sometimes to speak with spirits, to distant places to see what was happening there, to the future to see what would come, to the web of fate that the Norns wove at the base of Yggdrasil. While in trance, the Vurlva could answer questions. She could tell you if your missing relative was alive or dead. She could predict the weather for the coming season. She could reveal hidden things, secret things, uncomfortable truths. She could also curse people. This was the darker side of seiðr, the part that made people nervous. A skilled practitioner could send nightmares, cause illness, ruin someone's luck. The magic could kill, though it took time and skill. And this is where it gets interesting, because the Vikings had very specific gender roles. Men were supposed to be warriors. They solved problems with weapons and direct confrontation. Fighting openly was honorable. Killing in battle was glorious. Seiðr was the opposite. It was subtle, hidden, indirect. It involved trance states and spirit work and manipulation of invisible forces. It was powerful, but it wasn't manly. The word they used was ergi, unmanly, effeminate, shameful for a man. Practicing seiðr could damage a man's reputation. It suggested he was weak, cowardly, willing to use women's tricks instead of honest combat. But Freyja practiced seiðr, and she taught it to Odin, the most powerful of the male gods. Odin didn't care about the stigma. He wanted power, knowledge, control over fate itself. If that meant practicing women's magic, fine, he did it anyway. But the myths acknowledge that it was controversial. Loki mocks him for it in Lokasenna, calling him ergi, accusing him of shameful behavior. Odin's response is essentially, yes, and I practice seiðr. I've learned women's magic. I've sacrificed my eye and hung on Yggdrasil and done everything necessary to gain knowledge. Insult me all you want, I'm still more powerful than you. Freyja invented it. She brought seiðr from the Vanir to the Aesir. She taught the gods something they didn't know, gave them access to power they couldn't otherwise reach. This made her both essential and unsettling. The male gods needed her knowledge, but they didn't fully understand it. Seiðr operated by different rules than the magic they were used to. It was intuitive, emotional, connected to fate and prophecy in the spirit world. It was also deeply feminine in ways that had nothing to do with weakness. The Vurlur were powerful. They were feared. They could speak truths that made kings uncomfortable. They could see the future and couldn't be forced to lie about it. Freyja embodied this power. She saw what was coming, knew what was hidden, shaped fate itself. And she didn't apologize for it, didn't make it palatable or safe or easy to understand. The male gods respected her for it, even if they didn't fully trust it. The poetry of desire Freyja appears in the skaldic poetry, the complex metaphorical poetry that Vikings loved in some interesting ways. Poets would use her name as a kenning, a poetic metaphor for woman. Any woman could be called Freyja of something in a poem. But they also used her tears as a kenning for gold. Freyja's tears meant gold. Tears of the sister of Freyja meant gold. Any poetic description of her weeping became a way to describe wealth and treasure. This linguistic trick embedded her into the culture in a specific way. You couldn't talk about gold without invoking her grief. You couldn't describe wealth without mentioning her loss. The poets also used her name in kennings about love and beauty and desire. A beautiful woman was a Freyja. A love affair was Freyja's game. Jewelry was Freyja's ornament. But warfare also involved her. Remember, she claims half the slain. Battle could be described as Freyja's harvest or the choosing of Freyja. Dead warriors were Freyja's chosen. The language made it impossible to separate love from war, beauty from death, desire from violence. They were all Freyja. She encompassed all of it. There's a specific poem, a love poem, that invokes her by name. A man trying to seduce a woman calls on Freyja to help him, to make the woman desire him, to bless their union. The poem is explicit about what he wants, and it treats sexual desire as something sacred, something worth asking the gods to bless. This is so different from how medieval Christianity treated sex. The Christian writers who recorded these myths were often horrified by the Vikings' openness about desire, their willingness to pray to a goddess for help with seduction. But the Vikings didn't see sex as shameful. It was part of life, part of fertility and abundance in human connection. Freyja, as the goddess of desire, blessed all of it. Marriage and affairs, love and lust, everything that drew people together. She was the goddess you prayed to when you wanted someone to love you back, when you wanted passion in your marriage, when you wanted children, when you wanted to feel beautiful and desirable. And people did pray to her constantly. Archaeological sites across Scandinavia have found offerings that were clearly meant for Freyja: amber beads, jewelry, small figurines of women. These were left at sacred sites, at boundary stones, at places where the physical world and the divine realm touched. The offerings tell us that Freyja was real to people, not metaphorical, not abstract, real. A goddess who listened, who cared, who responded, or at least people believed she did. And maybe that belief itself was a kind of magic. Maybe invoking Freyja's name gave you confidence, courage, strength. Maybe wearing amber made you feel beautiful because you associated it with her. Maybe praying before battle helped you face death because you knew Freyja might choose you for her hall. The line between divine intervention and psychological effect doesn't really matter. The result was the same. People felt Freyja's presence in their lives. They felt blessed by her, guided by her, connected to something larger than themselves. The names she takes, we've mentioned that Freyja has many names, but let's look at them more closely, because each one reveals something different. Freyja itself just means lady. It's a title, not a personal name. Her actual name, her birth name, is never given in the surviving sources. We don't know what her parents called her, if she even had a different name originally. Mardril, sea brightener, refers to her golden tears that light up the ocean. It's a name about grief and beauty, and the way pain can create something luminous. Hern means either flax or possibly comes from a root meaning noble or great. If it means flax, it connects her to textile work, to women's domestic labor, to the cultivation of plants used for cloth. If it means noble, it's a straightforward title of respect. Jeffin means giver or generous one. This name emphasizes her aspect as a fertility goddess, someone who gives abundance, children, prosperity. She gives blessings to those who honor her. Sir means sow, the female pig. This connects her to her sacred animal, the boar, to fertility, to the earth and its creatures. Pigs were important in Norse culture. They provided meat, they could forage for themselves, they reproduced quickly. Valfreyja, Lady of the Slain, directly states her role as a goddess who claims warriors. This is her war goddess aspect, the part that matches Odin in power. Vanadis, Lady of the Vanir, marks her as foreign to Asgard, as someone who came from elsewhere and brought her own power with her. Each name is a different mask, a different role, a different way of being Freyja. When she traveled through Midgard searching for Other, she used these names to move unrecognized. Each name allowed her to be someone else while still being herself. This multiplicity is important. Freyja refuses to be one thing. She's a love goddess and a war goddess. She's beautiful and dangerous. She's generous and possessive. She weeps and she fights. She claims the dead and she blesses the living. The other gods have some complexity, sure. Odin is both wise and cruel. Thor is both heroic and kind of stupid. But Freyja's contradictions are more fundamental. Her entire mythology is built on things that shouldn't coexist but do: love and war, beauty and death, desire and sorrow. She's not a simple fertility goddess who just makes crops grow and babies be born. She's not a simple war goddess who just helps warriors fight. She's both, and she's also the goddess of magic, and also the goddess who weeps for lost love, and also the goddess who rides in a cat-drawn chariot wearing a falcon cloak. She contains multitudes. She refuses simplification. The medieval Christian writers who recorded these myths tried to simplify her. They emphasized the sexual aspects, called her a shameful pagan goddess, used her as an example of why Christianity was morally superior. But they couldn't erase her complexity. Even in their hostile accounts, Freyja remained stubbornly herself, powerful, independent, impossible to reduce to a single story or a single moral lesson. The forgotten rituals we know less about how Freyja was actually worshipped than we'd like, because the Vikings didn't write things down until after they'd converted to Christianity. The rituals, the sacred sites, the specific prayers, most of that is lost. But we have hints, archaeological evidence, place names, fragments in the sagas that mention religious practices before quickly moving on. There were sacred groves dedicated to Freyja. Specific trees, specific locations where the veil between worlds was thin. People would leave offerings there, food, drink, valuable objects. Sometimes animals were sacrificed, their blood poured out as an offering. There were priestesses who tended these sites. We don't know exactly what they did, but they would have maintained the sacred space, accepted offerings on Freyja's behalf, perhaps performed rituals at specific times of year. Some scholars think there were seasonal festivals for Freyja. Spring festivals for fertility, asking her to bless the fields and the flocks. Autumn festivals giving thanks for the harvest. Midwinter festivals when the darkness was deepest and people needed to invoke gods of light and warmth and survival. The Vurlur definitely performed rituals that involved Freyja. We have descriptions of these from the sagas, the seeress arriving in her ritual clothing, sitting in the high seat, the women singing around her. This was Freyja's magic being performed in real time, with real people for real community needs. And then there were private devotions. The woman praying for a child, leaving amber beads at a shrine. The warrior praying before battle, asking Freyja to notice him if he falls, to choose him for her hall. The young person in love, asking for Freyja's blessing, for the courage to speak, for the beloved to love them back. These weren't recorded. They were personal, private, individual moments between a person and their goddess, but they would have been constant, daily, woven into ordinary life. Freyja wasn't just worshipped at great festivals. She was present in people's bedrooms and barns and battlefields. She was the goddess you talked to in your head while you worked, while you worried, while you hoped. When Christianity came, the formal worship of Freyja ended. The temples were destroyed or converted into churches. The priestesses either converted or were killed or simply stopped practicing publicly. The sacred groves were cut down. But the private devotion probably continued for a while, in secret, in quiet ways. Old women who still whispered prayers to Freyja when no one was listening. Farmers who still left offerings at certain stones because their grandparents had and it seemed like it worked. Mothers who still invoked Freyja's name when praying for their children, even if they pretended they were praying to Mary instead. The transition from paganism to Christianity took centuries and wasn't clean. People held onto the old gods in small ways, even as they publicly converted. Freyja especially, because she was so connected to women's lives and women's concerns, might have lingered in folk practices longer than the male gods did. There are folk tales from medieval Scandinavia about a beautiful woman who appears in the forest, who helps people with fertility problems, who blesses marriages. These tales were told by Christians who would have been horrified to admit they were still telling stories about a pagan goddess. But the woman in the forest who gives blessings and has golden jewelry and knows magic, that's Freyja. She's just wearing a different name. The goddess survived in fragments, in folk memory, in stories that got Christianized but still carried echoes of the old beliefs. Freyja and Frigg, the same or different? We need to address the confusion between Freyja and Frigg because scholars have argued about this for centuries. Frigg is Odin's wife, the queen of Asgard. She's a goddess of marriage, motherhood, domestic affairs. She knows fate. The myths say she knows everything that will happen, but she never reveals it. She weaves clouds in her hall. She's the mother of Balder, the most beautiful and beloved of all the gods. Freyja is the Vanir goddess of love, war, magic, and death. She's independent, has her own hall, claims her own warriors. She's associated with passion and desire, not domestic stability. They seem like different goddesses, right? But here's where it gets weird. Both of them are associated with knowledge of fate. Both of them practice magic. Both of them are described as beautiful and powerful. Both of them have aspects that relate to women's roles and women's power. Frigg's husband is Odin. Freyja's missing husband is Other. The names are suspiciously similar, almost the same, just different forms of the same root word. Some scholars think Frigg and Freyja were originally the same goddess who split into two different figures as the mythology developed. Maybe there was once just one great goddess, wife of the chief god, and over time different aspects of her worship separated into different divine personalities. Other scholars think they were always separate but got conflated because both were important goddesses and people sometimes mix them up. The medieval sources don't help because they're inconsistent. Some poems clearly distinguish between them. Others seem to use their names interchangeably. Some stories that involve Frigg in one version involve Freyja in another. Here's what we can say. In the myths as we have them, they're treated as separate goddesses. They have different halls, different roles, different personalities. Frigg is stable, domestic, queenly. Freyja is passionate, independent, wild. But they share something fundamental. They're both goddesses who know more than they say. Frigg knows fate but won't speak it. Freyja practices seiðr and can see the future. They both have access to hidden knowledge, and they both choose when and whether to share it. They're also both contrasted with the male gods in interesting ways. The male gods are active, aggressive, constantly doing things. They fight and scheme and quest and make noise. Frigg and Freyja are more subtle. They work through knowledge and magic and influence. They shape events without being obvious about it. They have power that the male gods can't quite match or understand. Whether they were originally the same goddess or always separate, they represent something important about how the Vikings understood feminine power. It's not weaker than masculine power, it's different. It operates by different rules. It's connected to fate, to magic, to knowledge that can't be won through violence. The gods need both. Odin needs Frigg's wisdom and Freyja's magic. Thor needs their support. The cosmos itself needs their presence to function, but they remain mysterious. Even in the myths that feature them, they're holding back. They know more than they say. They see more than they reveal. Maybe that's the point. Maybe feminine divine power in Norse thought was always supposed to be somewhat hidden, somewhat unknowable. Not because it was weak, but because it was so powerful it couldn't be fully grasped. The children of Freyja, let's talk about Eithnos and Gersemi, Freyja's daughters, because their near total absence from the myths is kind of fascinating. Both names mean treasure. Eithnos comes from a word meaning jewel or precious thing. Gersemi means treasure or precious object. These aren't just cute names. In Norse culture, names carried power and meaning. Calling your daughters treasure meant something. For Freyja, who loves gold more than almost anything, who wears Brísingamen and weeps tears of red gold, naming her daughters after precious things makes perfect sense. They were treasures to her, the most valuable things she possessed. They barely appear in the surviving myths. We know they exist. We know their names. We know their father was Other, the missing husband, and that's about it. No stories about their childhoods, no descriptions of their personalities, no adventures or marriages or conflicts. They're mentioned in passing and then forgot. Some scholars think this is just because the sources are incomplete. The myths we have are fragments of a much larger tradition. Maybe there were stories about Eithnos and Gersemi that simply didn't get written down before Christianity wiped out the old religion. Other scholars think their absence is deliberate. They represent something Freyja lost, something precious that disappeared when Other left. Maybe they went with him. Maybe they grew up and left on their own journeys. Maybe they stayed in Vanaheim, the realm of the Vanir, when Freyja moved to Asgard. There's a sadness in that absence. Freyja, the goddess who blesses mothers and helps women with childbirth, apparently doesn't have her own daughters present in her life. She named them treasure and then lost them somehow. Or maybe they're fine and we just don't hear about them because the myths focus on conflict and drama, and two goddesses living peaceful lives isn't exciting enough to record. Maybe Eithnos and Gersemi are in Sessrumnir right now, helping their mother tend to the slain warriors, practicing magic, living their own immortal lives off camera. We don't know. What we do know is that Freyja understands loss. She lost her husband. Her daughters are absent from the stories. She claims warriors who have died, filling her hall with people who can never go home. She weeps gold, which means her grief is literally the source of treasure. There's something almost unbearably poignant about a goddess of fertility and love whose own family is broken and scattered. A goddess who helps others with their relationships but can't keep her own husband from leaving. A goddess who blesses children but whose daughters have vanished from the narrative. Maybe that's why people prayed to her. Not because she had perfect answers, but because she understood what it meant to love and lose. She wasn't a distant deity promising impossible things. She was someone who knew grief intimately and kept going anyway. The sacred boar, let's go back to boars for a moment, because there's more to say about Freyja's connection to them. Her brother Freyja's boar, Gullinbursti, was made by dwarves. Its bristles were gold, and it could run through the air and across the sea faster than any horse. It glowed in the dark, lighting Freyja's path. It was magnificent, magical, clearly a treasure of the gods. Freyja's boar, Hildisvíni, is more mysterious. The name means battle swine, which connects it to her war goddess aspect. But we only see it in the story where it's actually Adar in disguise, transformed by Freyja's magic. Did Freyja have her own sacred boar separate from that incident? Probably. Boars were too important to her mythology for Hildisvíni to be just a one-time magical disguise. In Norse culture, boars were complicated symbols. They were fierce and dangerous. A cornered boar could kill a man with its tusks. Hunters respected them and feared them, but they were also symbols of prosperity and abundance. A herd of swine meant wealth, meant you had enough food for winter, meant security. Boar helmets were worn by warriors. The image of a boar on your helmet was supposed to offer protection, to invoke the boar's fighting spirit. Some of these helmets were decorated with gold, echoing Gullinbursti's golden bristles. There were ritual boar sacrifices, especially at Yule, the midwinter festival. Boar was sacred, and killing it was a significant offering. The meat would be eaten at the feast, shared among the community. The bristles and tusks might be kept as sacred objects. Freyja's association with boars connects her to all of this, to warfare, to fertility, to feasting and community, to sacrifice and sacredness. And there's something deeply earthy about boars. They root in dirt. They're connected to the ground, to the physical world. This fits with Freyja being a Vanir goddess, one of the deities of the earth and its abundance. Contrast this with Odin's horse Sleipnir, who flies through the air between worlds, or Thor's goats, who pull his chariot and can be killed and eaten and resurrected. The gods' sacred animals tell you something about their nature. Freyja's cats are independent and mysterious. Her falcon cloak lets her fly and transform. But her boar is grounded, fierce, connected to the earth and to battle and to the sustaining of life through blood and meat. She encompasses all of it, sky and earth, independence and ferocity, beauty and violence. The ones who came after when Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, starting around the 8th century and taking several hundred years to fully convert the population. Freyja didn't disappear immediately. She transformed. She went underground. She became something else. In some regions, her characteristics got absorbed into the Virgin Mary. This wasn't official church doctrine. The church would have been horrified by the comparison, but it happened anyway at the folk level. People prayed to Mary for help with fertility and childbirth, the same things they used to pray to Freyja for. They gave Mary some of Freyja's old epithets and associations. There's a theory that the phrase Our Lady in medieval Christian devotion has echoes of Freyja, whose name literally means lady. When people said Our Lady, were they unconsciously keeping alive the memory of the goddess they used to worship? Probably not consciously, but language holds memory. Practices hold memory. The things people do and say carry traces of what came before. In other places, Freyja became a demon. Christian writers reinterpreted the old gods as devils, as evil spirits that had deceived people into worship. Freyja, with her associations with sexuality and magic, was easy to demonize. She became a temptress, a witch, a figure of pagan corruption. But even as a demon, she was still powerful. The folklore preserved her magic, her connection to prophecy and fate. The witch riding through the night sky, that's Freyja in her falcon cloak, transformed into something frightening by Christian fear. Some scholars think the figure of the Verolva, the wandering seeress, persisted in folk tales as the witch or the wise woman. These were women who lived outside normal social structures, who practiced magic, who helped people with problems the church couldn't solve. They were feared and needed in equal measure. Were they consciously worshipping Freyja? Probably not by the late medieval period, but they were doing Freyja's work, magic, prophecy, helping women with fertility and childbirth, cursing enemies, seeing the future. The goddess had been officially banished, but her functions remained necessary. Someone still needed to do women's magic. Someone still needed to see what was hidden. Someone still needed to help with love and desire, and the problems the church pretended didn't exist. In Iceland especially, the old stories were preserved even after conversion. Icelanders wrote down the myths, recorded the poems, created the sagas. They were Christian when they did this, writing in the 13th century about beliefs from the 9th and 10th centuries, but they wrote it down. They preserved Freyja, Odin, Thor, all of them in ink and vellum, maybe as historical record, maybe as entertainment, maybe because the stories were too good to lose. Those medieval manuscripts, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, the sagas, are why we know anything about Freyja at all. Without them, she'd be completely lost. Maybe a few place names would remain, a few carved stones, but her myths, her personality, her complexity, all of that would be gone. The Christian writers who preserved her didn't always understand her. They sometimes moralized, sometimes got details wrong, sometimes imposed their own cultural assumptions, but they wrote it down. And now, 1,000 years later, we can still read about the goddess who wept tears of gold and claimed half the slain and taught magic to Odin and refused to be controlled. Freyja in the modern world, Freyja didn't stay buried in medieval manuscripts. She came back. In the 19th century, there was a huge romantic nationalism movement across Europe. People became fascinated with their pre-Christian histories, their indigenous myths and legends. In Scandinavia, this meant rediscovering the Norse gods. Artists painted Freyja. She appeared in paintings as a beautiful woman in flowing robes, usually surrounded by cats, wearing Brísingamen, looking ethereal and romantic. These Victorian and Romantic-era images bear very little resemblance to how Vikings would have imagined her, but they kept her alive in cultural memory. Composers wrote music about her. Richard Wagner included the Norse gods in his Ring cycle operas, though he focused more on Odin and the other Aesir. Still, Freyja made appearances in various Romantic-era works. Writers retold the myths, sometimes accurately, sometimes wildly embellished, but always keeping the stories in circulation. Every retelling, even the inaccurate ones, meant new generations encountered Freyja's name and learned something about her. And then in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Norse mythology exploded in popular culture. Fantasy novels, video games, comic books, movies. Thor became a superhero. Odin appeared in countless stories. Loki became a complex antihero. Freyja shows up too, though less consistently. Sometimes she's portrayed accurately, a powerful goddess of magic and war and love. Sometimes she's reduced to a generic sexy goddess with none of her complexity. Sometimes she's barely present, reduced to a mention or a background character. But there's also been a movement to reclaim her more fully. Modern pagans who practice various forms of Norse-inspired spirituality often worship Freyja. They reconstruct rituals, make offerings, invoke her in prayers. They honor her as a goddess of women's power, of magic, of independence. Feminist scholars have written about Freyja as a figure of feminine autonomy. She's a goddess who refuses to be traded or controlled, who owns her sexuality, who has power that rivals the male gods. In a mythology full of complex female figures, she stands out. The challenge is separating the authentic medieval sources from later Romanticism and modern interpretation. We know what the 13th century Icelandic Christians wrote about Freyja. We know something about how Vikings might have understood her based on archaeological evidence and linguistic analysis, but we don't really know what an 8th century Norwegian farmer praying to Freyja for a good harvest actually believed. We don't know exactly how a 10th century Danish Vrova performing seiðr understood her relationship to the goddess. Those voices are lost. What we have is fragments. Beautiful, fascinating, complex fragments, and we have the freedom to engage with those fragments, to interpret them, to find meaning in them for our own time. Freyja as a symbol of feminine power resonates differently now than it did 1,000 years ago. The specific contexts have changed completely, but the core of her mythology, the refusal to be controlled, the embrace of both beauty and violence, the claiming of power in multiple domains, that still speaks to people. She's been a goddess, a demon, a romantic fantasy, a feminist icon, a video game character. She's been reinterpreted and reimagined countless times, and somehow through all of it she remains recognizable. The woman who wept gold, the goddess who claimed warriors, the teacher of magic who even Odin had to learn from, the one who loved and lost and kept searching. What we'll never know, there's a lot we'll never know about Freyja, and it's worth acknowledging that directly. We don't know what the original worship looked like before it was filtered through Christian writers. The rituals, the prayers, the exact nature of the relationship between Freyja and her worshippers, all of that is speculation based on fragments. We don't know if Other was really Odin or his own separate god, or a poetic metaphor, or all three somehow. The myths don't clarify, and modern scholars have argued about it for centuries without reaching consensus. We don't know what happened to Hnoss and Gersemi. We don't know if Freyja found Other when she went searching. We don't know what she did at Ragnarok or if she survived it. We don't know how she felt about being traded to Asgard as a hostage after the war. Did she resent it? Did she see it as an opportunity? Did she miss Vanaheim? We don't know the full extent of her magic. The sources mention seiðr, but they don't explain exactly how it worked or what its limits were. We know Freyja could see the future, but could she change it? We know she practiced magic that could shape fate, but we don't know the details. We don't know if the myths we have are anything close to the full story. These are fragments preserved by accident, written down by people who didn't fully believe in them anymore, describing a religion that had already been dead for generations. How much was lost? How many stories, how many aspects of Freyja's mythology simply vanished when the last Vrova died, and the last temple was destroyed, and the last person who truly believed in her stopped praying? We'll never know. What we have is enough to sketch an outline. A goddess of contradictions, a figure of power and grief, someone who loved gold and magic and warriors, someone who wept and searched and claimed half the slain. The details, the nuances, the full complexity of how Vikings understood and related to Freyja, that's lost to time, and maybe that's appropriate. Freyja was always somewhat mysterious, even in the myths. She knew things she didn't reveal. She practiced magic that couldn't be fully explained. She wore many names and traveled in disguise. She was never meant to be completely understood. Some things remain hidden, remain sacred, remain just out of reach. The eternal search lets end where we began, in a way, with Freyja searching. She's still looking for Other in the myths, still traveling through distant lands, still weeping tears of gold, still taking different names in different places. It's an eternal quest with no clear resolution. Maybe she finds him and he leaves again. Maybe she never finds him and keeps searching. Maybe the search itself is the point, the journey more important than the destination. There's something profound about a goddess defined partly by her longing, by her refusal to accept loss as final, by her determination to keep searching even when the search seems hopeless. The Vikings valued perseverance. They lived in a harsh world where you kept going even when things were terrible, because what other choice did you have? Winter would come whether you were ready or not. The sea would be dangerous whether you sailed or not. Death would find you whether you fought well or poorly. You kept going. You endured, you did what needed to be done. Freyja searching for Other embodies that ethos. She doesn't give up. She doesn't accept his absence as permanent. She keeps moving, keeps looking, keeps hoping, even though she probably knows with her prophetic vision that the search is endless. Maybe that's the most Freyja thing of all. Knowing the future, seeing that things won't work out the way you want, and choosing to try anyway. Choosing to love anyway. Choosing to search anyway. She weeps, but she doesn't stop moving. She grieves, but she doesn't lose herself. She feels the pain fully, and the pain becomes treasure, becomes gold, becomes something beautiful even though it came from loss. That transformation, pain into treasure, grief into gold, might be the heart of her mythology. The idea that suffering doesn't have to be meaningless. It can create something. It can have value, not because pain is good, but because what you do with it matters. Freyja took her grief and made it generative. She kept claiming warriors. She kept teaching magic. She kept blessing those who prayed to her. She kept being present in people's lives even though her own life was marked by absence. The modern world doesn't have Vurler anymore. We don't sacrifice to Freyja at sacred groves or wear amber beads as invocations of her blessing. The literal worship is gone, but the questions she embodied remain. How do you maintain autonomy in a world that wants to control you? How do you hold on to love and desire in the face of loss? How do you transform grief into something that has meaning? How do you keep going when the search seems endless? These are still human questions, still relevant, still urgent, still without easy answers. Freyja doesn't provide solutions. She's not a how-to guide for living. She's a goddess, powerful and complex and ultimately mysterious, but she offers a model, not a perfect one. The gods were never meant to be perfect. But a model of someone who claimed power in multiple domains, who refused to be simplified, who loved deeply and grieved fully and kept searching. Someone who wept tears of gold and called it treasure. Closing, the hall in Fólkvangr. It's late now. We've been here for hours, wandering through myths and fragments and speculation. Let's settle in for the final stretch. Imagine Seiðr, Freyja's hall in Fólkvangr. The poets say it's beautiful, though they don't give us many details. Let's picture it anyway. Golden walls probably, because Freyja loves gold, but not ostentatious, something warm and welcoming. A hall where warriors come after death, where they find comfort and rest and whatever reward the afterlife offers. Freyja chooses them, half of all who fall in battle. She is first pick before Odin claims his share for Valhalla. What criteria does she use? The myths don't say. Maybe she chooses the ones who fought for love, who protected their families, their communities, their people. Maybe she chooses the ones who understood that battle is necessary but not glorious. That death is real and final and tragic even when it's honorable. Or maybe she just chooses the ones she likes. The ones who remind her of people she's loved. The ones whose deaths make her weep those golden tears. In Seiðr, what do the warriors do? Valhalla's warriors fight all day and feast all night, preparing for Ragnarok. But Freyja's hall is different. It's not primarily about war. Maybe they rest. Maybe they heal. Maybe they feast and tell stories and remember their lives. Maybe they learn seiðr magic from the goddess herself. Maybe they're there because they needed something gentler than endless battle preparation. The myths don't tell us. They're frustratingly vague about Freyja's afterlife realm. But the vagueness leaves room for imagination, for hope. Hope that the afterlife isn't all about fighting and dying again at Ragnarok. Hope that there's a place where warriors can rest, where love matters more than violence, where the goddess who understands grief offers comfort. Freyja sits in her hall, wearing Brísingamen, surrounded by her chosen warriors. Outside, the field of Fólkvangr stretches away into wherever the Norse afterlife goes. Her cats drowse by the hearth. Her falcon cloak hangs ready for whatever journey she might take next. And maybe, somewhere in the hall, there's an empty seat, waiting for Other. Just in case he comes back, just in case the search finally ends, or maybe there isn't. Maybe Freyja has moved on. Maybe she's filled her hall with new loves, new friends, new people to care about. Maybe she's learned to hold her grief and her joy at the same time, to weep gold while also smiling. We don't know. The myths don't tell us the ending because there isn't an ending. Freyja is eternal. She's still claiming warriors, still practicing magic, still being herself in whatever form that takes now that belief has changed. She's in the old stories, preserved in medieval manuscripts. She's in modern retellings, transformed and reimagined. She's in the amber that washes up on beaches, golden like her tears. She's in every act of defiance, every refusal to be controlled, every complicated woman who claims power in a world that wants to simplify her. She's still searching, in a way. Still present, still mysterious, still refusing to be just one thing, and maybe that's enough. Maybe gods don't need tidy endings. Maybe Freyja's story is meant to be unfinished, ongoing, open to interpretation. She wept tears of gold. She claimed half the slain. She taught magic to Odin himself. She loved and lost and kept going. That's the story. That's all we know, and it's enough. Thanks for staying with me through this long, wandering journey through Freyja's mythology. I hope you found it interesting, or at least sleep-inducing, which was kind of the point. The goddess of love and war, beauty and death, magic and grief, she's still out there somewhere in the stories we tell, in the amber on the shore, in the golden light of sunset. Still searching, still powerful, still Freyja. Good night.